Hello everyone, this is Professor Hill. This is a short video for our class Introduction to Ethics Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College for the summer one term. And today is Wednesday, the 23rd of June, 2021, which means that we are dead center of this course. We are halfway through the halfway week, and means we've got 2.5 weeks behind us and 2.5 weeks to go. So, we've got an assignment due tomorrow, Thursday the 24th. That's our next essay. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's a complicated one involving medical ethics. And it was also, when it occurred, was a case of first impression, meaning that the technology had just evolved. And so there wasn't a lot of guidance for the family, for Jack and Lisa. It was a new technology which gave them decisions nobody had to make before. And so they struggled with what to do. But in the end, and this is an interesting piece about this is again for our case study, the Nash family. They were parents of a child who was going to die. So they were basically willing to do anything. And that's kind of their role, right? Their role is to be advocates, to protect their child, to do whatever it takes. So one of the questions we have to have as a society is, are those the people that should be making that choice? Because they're not trying to weigh and balance all the factors. They're just zeroed in on what's best for my daughter, Molly, who's dying. So I think it's understandable that they were willing to try things, willing to push boundaries, willing to do things which no one had done before. And not just because the technology was available, but their attitude was, if we can, we should, because it's all about saving our daughter. Now, maybe we should have some group, some medical panel, some ethics board, somebody that doesn't have a conflict of interest. They don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. They're not biased because they are involved. They might be more willing to have a studied, expert, objective opinion, because it turns out we do that with some things in our society. It's like if somebody commits a murder and is arrested by the police, well, we turn that person over to the criminal justice system, where there are lawyers. We bring in jurors who don't have, again, a conflict or a bias. We go out of our way to make sure that they don't. We have a judge who oversees it to make sure it's fair, so that you get justice from person to person, and you don't get unequal treatment or punishment, at least as little as possible, for similarly situated plaintiffs, because you hopefully have turned this over to professionals who do it all the time, are experts in the field, and can do it with a bit of detachment. You know, if we had and again, this is an interesting little thing. I'll just mention this briefly because it's relevant to the Nash family. There was a case in Saudi Arabia where these two Australian nurses were killed. They were there working as part of, for Aramco, as a nurse program, where they would bring in foreign nurses to work in the hospitals and stuff. And some people would do it for short-term stints, 3 months, 6 months, a year, that kind of thing. Well, they were there working, and they were murdered, and it was a terrible tragedy, and the families were upset, but the authorities caught the person that did it, and they tried them and convicted them. And the way this works is, in Saudi Arabia, they do have the death penalty, but here's the thing, which is at that stage, after the are you guilty or not stage, you get to the punishment stage, there the families have a role. See, they don't really here in the United States. Sentencing, there's sentencing guidelines from the legislative branch. It falls within the discretion of the judge. There's, again, within the guidelines to consider all the factors. But there, in Saudi, they would say things like, look, we're going to put this person to death, but the family, we want to hear what you have to say. And if you want, you could spare this person's life and we'll give them life in prison rather than the death penalty. And what happened was the family of the first nurse, they were from Australia, which has the exact opposite view about capital punishment. They don't have the death penalty. There's a very strong kind of cultural sense of values and norms that are opposed to that. And so they said, no, please spare the person. But then what happened was the husband of the second nurse was like, you know what? Put him to death. And they did. And what happened was that guy goes back to Australia and he gets a lot of pushback from people. They're like, everybody's angry with him because he had the power to just have it go to life imprisonment rather than death penalty, and he didn't. And there was this kind of outpouring of rage against him. It was really, again, because it cut against this kind of norm in Australia. But he had made the decision that, you know what? Now, what's interesting is we don't even do that. Not least of which is we don't want the situation where if there had been two murders and two murderers, that one gets off and one gets put to death. They get very different sentences for the same crime. So that strikes us as being fundamentally unjust. And so, although in the United States, because the families were excluded for so long, they did finally, different states have done this, where the families have impact statements where they can come in and speak to the person after they've been convicted, after they've been sentenced. A lot of times they can just say, they can vent their feelings. Sometimes they can do it during the sentencing. It depends on the state. During the sentencing to say, this is why I think you need to give this person either a lighter sentence or a more severe sentence. And they describe the impact upon themselves. This is what happened to me because my loved one was murdered, that kind of thing. Anyway, it's relevant to this decision about the NASHs. In our system, and the medical ethics, the patients drive the decision making and the doctors give them options. But one of the questions is, should this have been an option presented to the family? Knowing that the family, of course, is going to lean into even radical or desperate therapies or options because they're trying to protect their little girl. So it's understandable that they would do that. So then the question becomes, well, is that the system we want? I don't know. So look, here's the thing about the Nash family. I mentioned yesterday it involves eugenics, and it does, because the specter of it is hiding in the tall grass around here. What I mean by that is, once you have the power to start, selecting based on these tests at this age at the stage of development of fertilized egg cells, we're talking about zygotes in the early cellular stages, then that, and the choice, again, what you saw here was they go through, they create a bunch of these, they test them, and the ones that don't fit the parameters, meaning that, they're not going to be a tissue match or they're going to already have the disease like Fanconi anemia, well, those you're not going to implant, so you just discard those. These you do implant, and of course, even then, you implant more than, because you don't want to just put it one in, and because it's risky, and sometimes the implantation doesn't hold, sometimes there's other problems, they don't develop properly, there's all the kind of things that can go wrong. So it would be a common practice to put in, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then get a couple of healthy candidates growing, and then select down to, did you want triplets? Did you want twins? Did you just want the one child? Which is the best candidate, and keep the one candidate that best fits your needs and hits the criteria. That's a pretty rough selection down process. But it raises this other question about what's next. People start with curing diseases or excluding fertilized egg cells that have the diseases. But that just means right around the corner are other characteristics. Height, sex, eye color. You kind of start with diseases, but once you start doing the process of selecting, then all of a sudden it gets harder and harder to justify, whatever characteristics you can control for, and we just get better and better and better with that. So we got a bad long history with eugenics of people trying to make better human beings, the Better Family Program here in the United States, the eugenics boards that we had. And of course, in other countries, people famously try to put a lot of this at the Nazis in their experiments, which were horrific. But again, it's not like it was just somehow limited to these bad Nazis. Like I said, this was happening in the United States through lots of programs in almost every state up into the 70s. I mean, it's crazy. But like I said, that's a long, bad history. I'll put a link in the module up to the eugenics in the United States. It's crazy. So that all being said, that was one of the kind of cans of worms that was being opened by this case. One of the things that you got to consider and unpack and say, do we really want to go down this path? But also, what's the alternative? Is the alternative the suffering and dying of children? We don't want that. Do we want where we've ended up now, by the way, because again, this was the case of first impression, the first time it happened, but now, because of the path we started with, Jack and Lisa Nash, I can tell you that the technology's gotten better, and it's now a common practice to do this. This happens every single day in the United States now. It's not controversial anymore. It's got all kinds of consequences and ramifications, not least of which is we're talking. Don't forget, this kind of stuff isn't covered by insurance. These are options for rich people and not poor people. And do we want it to be that? I mean, if your approach is just, yes, it's healthcare, but we treat it like, Lamborghinis. Rich people can afford Lamborghinis, so they get to drive them, and poor people don't. You can't afford a Lamborghini, so you don't get to drive one. Rich people's kids get to survive, but poor people's kids don't. That is another complex aspect on this case study. Jack and Lisa did this because they could afford to do this. There are other families that can't. And so, we've decided that, so far at least, that's, still a core value of our health care in the United States, which is that rich people get great health care in the United States, and poor people get to, start a GoFundMe page or sell barbecue plates. It strikes some of my friends who live in other places where they do it differently as being nutty, but that's how we continue to do it. So look, these factors are involved in this particular case. You should think about them. Do they change your mind? Or are they just, no, they're there, but I account for them, that's fine. It doesn't change my opinion about what should be done. But think about eugenics. Look at the link I put in the chat, and consider that when you're writing your essay for Jack and Lisa Nash and this particular case study. I'm going to do a separate video on the trolley problem, but that's for another tape. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye. He said confidently. Okay, bye. Try that again.